Hey gang, it's James coming on to do a talk that I've been meaning to do for a few days, and schedule's been wonky, so I haven't been able to. Speaking of wonky, my internet is wonky. I didn't have any at all earlier, and now it appears that I do, so hopefully it'll stick with me long enough to get this through. But I want to talk about leaven, specifically in the context of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. My intent with this talk is not to get into spiritual implications of what leaven is or is it not. You know, is it sin? Is it doctrine? Is it hypocrisy? You know, I'm not going to get into that, okay? What I want to do with this talk is just look at the commandment itself pertaining leaven and unleavened bread, and, you know, take a look at what that looks like today in 2023 America. How do we implement this as we endeavor to keep the Father's holy days? So I'm going to read a few scriptures here out of Exodus. First off, what is leaven? Okay, when you look at the word, the Hebrew word for leaven, I always pronounce it wrong, so I'm not even going to try. But basically, it has the idea of puffing up. Okay, which makes sense because when you leaven bread, it puffs up. Okay, that's pretty easy to understand. Okay, so let's just take a look here, and we're just going to kind of read through the commandment. I'm going to do it in two parts here. I'm going to read a little bit in Exodus 12. We're going to discuss it, and then we'll read a little bit more in Exodus 12, okay? This is all coming from Exodus 12. Okay, so let's start reading in Exodus 12, verse 14. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it until Calvary. I had to do that, guys. I had to do that. No, it doesn't say that. It says you shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. And we wonder why Paul says later, therefore let us keep the feast. Right? Talking about this. Okay, so 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Hopefully none of us want to be cut off from Israel. I know I don't. Hopefully you don't. Okay? So let's take a look and let's just stop and unpack this real quick, okay? We're coming off of Passover here. We're supposed to eat Passover with unleavened bread. Okay? So what is leaven? We can't look at it in terms of how it is now. Okay? These days, we can go to the grocery store. We have refrigeration. You can get leaven. It comes in little tubs or packets or whatever. If we're not going to use it right away, we can keep it in our fridge, you know, and we can store it long term. They didn't have that back then. Okay? Basically, when they were making bread, and I have to thank my lovely wife, my beautiful wife, for teaching me this, they made bread sourdough, which is great, because sourdough bread can be amazing. So, sourdough bread was what they made. And as I understand it, if you take flour and water, and you mix it all up, and you leave it sit in the just ambient air for a while, eventually, depending on where you're at, it can take a day or two, it can take a week. It depends on how much yeast you have floating around in your air naturally. Okay? It'll eventually settle in that bread and begin to ferment. Okay? That begins the sourdough process. Once you have that fermentation going and your sourdough starter is kicking off, then what you can do is you can keep that kind of like a mother. Okay? You can peel off little babies, and you can put those little babies in with your next batch of bread. So you mix up some flour and some water, you put a little pinch of sourdough starter in there, and instead of having to wait days, potentially, for it to happen on its own, you got to kickstart there. So you need that all in together, and then you can have, you know, risen sourdough bread pretty quickly. Okay? So, with that in mind, in 2023, when we look at this word for leaven, being that it means to rise or to puff up, okay, there are lots of different interpretations on what is leaven, okay? There's basically two ways of looking at it, and some people look at it both ways. One is it a product of fermentation? Is it a product of fermentation via yeast? Okay? This would be anything from alcohol, beer, whiskey, wine even, anything like that. Vinegar, because vinegar comes from fermentation. Those would all be fermented products that some people would say you can't have in your house for unleavened bread or Passover. Okay? Now, the other thing would be leavening agents. Okay, leavening agents. These are things that are not yeast, but they work the same way. They cause things to rise. These are things like baking soda, baking powder. Okay? When you get like store-bought tortillas, or I guess any tortillas, like flour tortillas, they don't put yeast in them. They put baking powder in them. And it doesn't rise like bread does, but it gives it just a little bit of a lighter texture, right? It's not so dense and heavy. And so that's one thing. The other thing is anything like getting bigger. Okay, this is really taking it to the nth degree. These are things like rice and pasta. With rice and pasta, when you put them in water, they expand because they soak up the water. And so some people interpret that as a form of leavening. It's growing the same way bread would if you introduced yeast to it. So every year, and my wife and I did this early on in our marriage. A lot of people do this, at least out here in Pennsylvania. I don't know how it is elsewhere, around. But you have people that will get rid of their baking soda toothpaste. They'll get rid of all of their alcohol. They'll get rid of their kombucha. Of course, bread, obviously. They'll even get rid of dog food because a lot of dog food has, leavening and bread products in it as a filler. Okay? Everything goes out of the house. Every single thing that can possibly, vinegar, pasta, rice, anything. Okay? And then, my thought process on the Father's commandments generally is this. His commandments have a literal interpretation that we all should be observing and keeping. Once we move beyond the literal interpretation, okay, then we have a couple different ways we can go. We might be able to take that literal interpretation and consider it a principle, and we can maybe apply it a little bit more broadly. Okay, there's room for that. But the problem is, once we move away from the literal principle, we open ourselves up to subjectivity. We open ourselves up for individual interpretation. Okay? And this is where we're at. The plain text doesn't address any of those things, like baking soda, baking powder. And you can make the argument that they probably weren't around back then. Okay? So, if they were around back then, would the commandment also include those? Maybe, maybe not. We'll never know. Okay? What we do know is that back then they did have alcoholic products. They had wine. They had beer in Egypt. Okay? They had these things. And we don't have anything in these commandments that says to get rid of that. It would have been really easy to do. Yeah, we could have easily put that in there. But he says to, the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever, when he says for, you shall remove leaven from your houses for whoever eats anything. So he's connecting the two ideas there. Whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So removing the leaven from our houses has to do with eating leavened products. And it's specifically called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? So it's my perspective that the commandment is only talking about leavening that would involve bread that we would eat. Okay? If I'm going to distill this down to its most basic meaning, that would be the point here. Okay? People generally don't take wine and mix it in their bread to leaven it. You can do that with beer. I mean, it would be fairly easy. I don't know that anybody does that. They don't take their baking soda toothpaste and put it in their bread to make it rise. Okay? These types of things. So, my way of looking at it is, let's just keep it basic. Alright? It's like with the Passover in general. There's no need to go into all this tradition that's not in the Word. There's no need to do the full-blown Jewish Seder. I mean, I suppose you could if you wanted to. But when the moment you do that, you're going above and beyond what the commandment says, and we're getting into traditions of men. Okay? So I advocate, for the Passover meal, lamb, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread. Anything beyond that is interpretation and addition. Same thing with leaven. Okay? Same thing with leaven. When we get into leaven and we start, interpreting it 6 ways to Sabbath, right? And, it's fine because, if you remove all of those things from your house, you're not breaking the commandment per se, okay? But I just don't think it's necessary to. I just don't think it's necessary to. I know lots of people that do those things. And that's cool. That's one of those things where we can agree to disagree. We can still be friends. We can still be brothers and sisters. But I'm saying, like for people who are endeavoring to keep this feast for the first time, maybe the second time, and you're struggling with what to get out of your house, okay? The easiest way to do it and still be biblically accurate is just to remove yeast that you would use to leaven your bread, okay? So, like our family, what we do is my wife looks through the fridge, she gets rid of, store-bought yeast, all of that stuff, that goes. We get rid of all of our, pre-made bread products, because they've already risen, crackers and bread and things like that. There's active leaven in there in some capacity. So we do get rid of that stuff, okay? We keep the baking soda, we keep the baking powder, we keep the toothpaste, we keep the vinegar, we keep, wine, that kind of thing. Okay, we don't get rid of that. And I feel like by doing so, we are still keeping the commandment. So let's take a look at another aspect of this to kind of make this case a little bit clearer, hopefully. Let's skip ahead to verse 37. Okay, this is on the way out. Okay, we've had the night of Passover. The firstborn have all died of Egypt, and now they're on their way out. So let's start reading in verse 37. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, Gentiles, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. Verse 39, they baked the dough, which, I got ahead of myself. I'll read this anyway. They baked the dough which they had brought out from Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Let's go back to verse 33. This is where I should have started. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Okay? So what I think they did here was, if you have sourdough starter, it's already leavened. Okay? They're not supposed to have leavened bread. They're supposed to get rid of the leavening. They probably got rid of their sourdough starters. Now, in their kneading troughs, they still have dough. People miss this. They still had bread dough. Now, that was a mixture of flour and water. Maybe they had some oil in it. Okay? And on their way out, they stopped to bake this. And it says in verse 39, it had not become leavened. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier with the sourdough concept. You can leave it out long enough and it will become leavened on its own because of the yeast floating around the atmosphere. They were baking it before that had a chance to happen. Okay? So, even if they had sourdough starter, okay, according to my wife, and I believe her, there is a possibility if you have a sourdough starter that has gone dormant. Okay? And it's easy for us to do now with refrigeration. But I think you can just don't feed it anything, right? It will like deflate. It will not puff up. Even though it still has yeast in it, it's not puffed up because it's inactive. I think it's possible they could have had that in their kneading troughs, but I think it's more likely that they probably just got rid of their sourdough starter altogether, and they probably just had plain, completely unleavened bread dough in their troughs. And they cooked it off before it had a chance to absorb the yeast from the air. Okay? Now here's the thing. Becoming leavened. This is why I'm tying this to sourdough so strongly. If I make bread dough with flour and water in my house, and I put it in a bowl, and I just let it sit on the counter, what is going to leaven that? How is it going to become leavened? Is my wine going to leaven it? Is my baking soda going to leaven it? What's going to happen with this if I just leave it there? How's it going to become leavened? It's going to become leavened by yeast floating in the air. That's the only way. Unless I actively add something to it, which I would never do during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? So, for me, it really is this simple. And if you want to go further than this, that's fine. That's totally cool. Alright? But, you know, if you are not of the mind, for a lot of people who are coming into this recently, it's overwhelming. Because you go online and you ask for advice and people tell you, you've got to get rid of this and you've got to get rid of that and you've got to get rid of this. Oh yeah, read the labels. It's overwhelming. Keep it simple, saints. Alright? The Father wants His people to keep His feasts. He's not going to put stumbling blocks in the way. Alright? So, you know, your first year, your second year, you know, you're going to miss things. Your 18th year, you're going to miss things. Alright? But the point is that we try and we do our best. Okay? So I advocate, get all the bread products out of your house. Okay? We start eating them up a few weeks before. My wife is diligent. She starts pulling them all out of, makes an inventory, and we just start cycling through. That way nothing gets wasted. We had a New Year's party with some friends of ours this past Sabbath, and we brought a lot of that stuff out to eat, right? When you come up to Passover, a lot of people, starting that week prior, now it does say to do it on the first day. It doesn't say you can't do it on the first day, so just for thoroughness' sake, a lot of people will get started maybe a week or so earlier, and then they will go around the house and do Passover cleaning. You're getting the bread out, you're maybe vacuuming, things like that, okay, crumbs and such, right? But I just personally don't see the need to go beyond that. Okay, I don't personally see the need, based on the text, to get rid of your alcohol, to get rid of your vinegar, to get rid of your baking soda, baking powder, your rice, your noodles, any of that stuff. I just don't see it. If you see it and you need to do that, that's great. Go ahead. You're not violating any commandment by doing that. I just don't think it's necessary. Okay? So that's my position on leaven, for whatever it's worth. Your mileage may vary, but that's how I interpret the text. Okay? We could have a discussion on what leaven means, symbolically and spiritually and all that kind of stuff, but that's not the purpose of this video. This purpose is just to kind of hopefully clear things up a little bit for people who are, doing this for the first time, second time, third time, have questions, that kind of thing. And it's okay if you disagree with me, but I'm a strong advocate in simplicity. Yahweh made certain things complicated. The Levitical system is complicated. Okay? If I was a Levitical priest and had to serve, I would be scared. Because everything has to be done perfectly, and it has to be done in absolute holiness. You don't want to be like Nadab and Abihu. Alright? Thankfully, we're not dealing with that level of precision here. Okay? The Father is looking at our hearts on this kind of thing, first and foremost. And yes, He is looking at, are we doing it correctly? But He's looking at more, why are we doing it? Alright, He knows we're coming out of 2,000 years of tradition and theologians telling us not to do this stuff, telling us not to obey the Bible. He knows that. Our Father's merciful, and He's a righteous judge. Which is why I always advocate when we keep the commandments, do the best you can where you're at. But every single year, we try to do it better. We try to learn more, we try to grow more, we try to increase our faith. Because when you do these holy days of Yahweh, it really is all about faith. There's no logical, rational reason to do this kind of stuff. You do this kind of stuff because you have faith in the God of Israel. Okay, that's why you do these things, and that's why He calls them signs between Him and His people perpetually, forever, everlasting. Muslims don't do these things, right? Do they? Buddhists don't do these things. Atheists don't do these things. Christians don't do these things, although they should. That's a travesty. It's an absolute travesty when you have a whole block of people who believe and who fear, but have had the wool pulled over their eyes that we need to do holidays that are not in Scripture in place of the ones that are in Scripture. That is a crime. It is a travesty. And it grieves me to look around and see people who have been led into that darkness. And it really is darkness because, for all the veneer that Easter, Christmas, and these things have, they look good on the outside. The cup looks really great. But on the inside, there's nothing there. The Father's holy days, on the other hand, we're told over and over and over again. These point to the Messiah. These are one of the ways the Father reveals His heart to us. And theologians have said, don't do that. It's Jewish. It's an absolute shame. So I'm going to leave it at that, guys. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm probably going to go, tongue-tied there. I'm probably going to go to sleep here in a minute because I got a long day tomorrow driving. But thank you for tuning in. Passover, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or find someone who has done this a while. Okay, I would say probably at least 5 years that preferably not some random guy out in cyberspace. See if you can find someone that you know personally who has experience and reach out to them. We're supposed to learn and grow together. The ones that have been doing this longer are supposed to help mentor and shepherd the ones who are new. So find someone. If it's not me, find someone else. Okay? Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions. All right? And if you're keeping Passover for the very first time, you have no idea what you're in for. The absolute blessing that walking in the Father's ways, when you walk Passover, you are walking in the footsteps of your Savior. And you don't get that with Easter. You don't get that with Easter. And I've kept Easter. I know. So I love you guys. Thanks for tuning in. As always, Yahweh bless.